All right, all week we have kept our focus on matters corruption in the country. Hashtag Graft Diaries is what we're using on social media. On SMS, you can also get in touch with us. The number is 22155. My guests are here. We have Njeri Thorne. We also have Wanjiru Gikonyo. We'll be getting to them in just a moment as we look at the way forward in the fight against corruption. But first, I'd like you to listen into what has been said about corruption and the way forward in the past week.
We call upon the executive, particularly the president, to act so that people of Kenya are protected against those who want to derail his plans for development.
If the president fails to do so, we shall begin a public mobilization for direct citizen action to address the problem of corruption in the country.
It's time now to declare for AIDS. I think we need to declare this as a national disaster so that extraordinary measures are taken.
All right, and that is what is being said. We have our panelists in studio. We'll start with you, Wanjiru. Let's talk about that press conference and that move to talk about that. We want the president to address the issue of corruption in the next 7 days. Tell us why and exactly what you expect when you say address the nation on the issue of corruption.
I think very clearly we agree. Looking at this, I concur with the Archbishop that we are facing a national disaster. In our press conference, we were able to share 22 cases of corruption that have taken place under the Jubilee administration that has only been in power for 2 years. And some of these are very blatant. You have state officers actually dispossessing individuals of their private property, like the Karen land scandals, very obvious things. Others are mega projects, government to government. Is questionable, and what it does is it undermines the rule of law. And what we are seeing is that impunity at the highest level is trickling down, and it's reinforcing what is really a very negative culture, and has been a negative culture because corruption didn't just start, but it's being exacerbated. And I think the government has said it themselves. If this continues, we will not meet our development goals, and we are looking beyond the development goals. Is our social fiber is really being undermined very severely.
Okay. Aden Duale responded to that, and I hope we can have some of those responses we got from quotes from the responses that he mentioned. Those should be on our Super Wall in just a moment, if we can have those, and then we'll have you respond to that. But back to the issue of addressing the nation. Well, what would that entail for you?
Head of state really is responsible for we heard the government, we heard the president make a very clear statement asking ministers to take certain actions, and we say no, that's not enough. We have a whole battery of laws. We had a national conversation on corruption in 2003, 2004. And that really brought about a whole architecture that is in place and has been enhanced under the new constitution. So we want to see action. We want to see decisive action on the EACC. We want to see decisive action on those officers who have been implicated in reports of government, in large-scale fraud against the people of Kenya. We really want the government to, we want the president to ensure enforcement of the laws that guide this country.
All right, and we'll get to that response, and we'll get to you, Njeri. You want to respond? Yes.
I just wanted to interject. This onus we're putting on the president. Independent institutions that have been set up to deal with these issues, and we would be sort of going against the constitution if he was asked to do it directly. So there are independent institutions set up to do that, and I think that's where the onus lies.
All right. Our contention is that because of this factor of the tyranny of numbers, we have a very strong parliament. Now, this parliament is a very formidable oversight institution if it uses its power properly. We have seen the character of the Jubilee government is really to drive members of parliament sometimes to contravene court orders. The standard gauge railway is a very good example. Against the advice of the Attorney General, against the advice of advisors like the World Bank, against against the advice of the Public Procurement Oversight Authority, which are these bodies,
All right.
the MPs were whipped and they were directed to vote a certain way. Institutions are overruled because of the party and the tyranny of numbers, then, where does the buck lie, really?
Okay. I'd like you to listen to or take a look at some of these responses that we have on our Super World. This is from Majority Leader of the National Assembly. This is what we have on our Super World tonight. He said the falsehoods being peddled by some activists as 20 corruption scandals is a new low for a nominally dishonest, reckless and myopic bunch of busybodies. Your response, Wanjiru?
I think the Majority Leader needs to remember he is governed by the Chapter 6. He is bound to tell the truth to Kenyans. And all the cases that we chronicled are out in the public domain, drawn from government reports. And if we were to really be very strict about who's telling the truth or not, the state officer has a very high standard, and we could call to question some of the hype and propaganda that's being sold to Kenyans. I think the president himself has acknowledged there's a national disaster. The only point of departure we have with the president is who's going to do something about it. We cannot afford to have the head of state look.
Okay, Jerry, you have a completely different approach to this. What do you think about the rhetoric and all of...
I think the reason we're finding that only government and even civil society isn't able to deal with it, and we're thinking only the president can deal with it, is because there is an aspect of a myopic view, whereby we believe only prosecution of these cases is the only solution to stop corruption.
You believe there's another?
I actually believe, having sort of institutional reform is very good, oversight legislation, but none of these will be successful if it's not embedded within our sort of culture. That's the real problem. And you hear people say this, it's part of our culture. What we need to start doing is understanding the psychology of what leads us to being corrupt, and then now working with programs around that. And I don't believe court cases and what's happening at the moment are helping the situation. Society within our psyche, and it could actually lead to more corruption as we're focused on these cases. It could also lead to more corruption by virtue of the fact that you're bringing to the forefront that corruption is available and possible. So I have quite a radical sort of idea of sort of a blanket amnesty. Let's start at zero, wipe the slate clean, and work on stopping corruption, further corruption.
What happens to accountability, Jerry?
Some of these cases, people have passed away since, and we're putting all our efforts and resources in this and not stopping it. And by having these cases in the limelight constantly, we're normalizing this. And what happens is if we take ourselves to the default position of not corrupt, excuse me, people will be enticed to stay not corrupt. Right now, there's nothing we're living up to. Being corrupt is the default position. So what we're doing in essence is creating a novel environment where even people sort of deliberatively think about their actions. Kibaki took over. There was a renewed optimism, and that's because the environment, the contextual cues had changed. It wasn't anybody's telling anyone you're going to go to court, so it doesn't act as a deterrent by taking people to court. It instead uses all our resources and our energy.
All right, allow me to interject, because what you're talking about is very long term, changing mindsets and changing a culture.
No, I'm looking to change behavior without having changed the mindset. After changing the behavior, we will change the mindset.
But that's not something that can happen.
If tomorrow we woke up and there's no corruption case because there's been a blanket amnesty, who would want to be the first person to commit corruption?
Wanjiru?
I think I agree with Jerry up to a point. I do agree that, we have a problem that stems from our culture. And it has been said, I think it's on record all over the world where corruption has been fought, that prosecution really is the blunt side of the weapon that works against corruption. Prosecutions are where you have more incentives for non-corrupt behavior. Now, the problem is that this culture is fueled so much by our elections. And, we have a recent by-election to draw from, because we have election laws that are very strict about the use of money to entice voters.
Right.
Yet we have evidence, we have people who've been arrested because money was poured. And some of this money was linked to state officers.
Well,
and
what we need to do is shift the onus
Jerry,
from the government to the people. There's people accepting
if
this.
Jerry will allow
Petty
me
corruption
to,
is just as much a problem as
maybe
grand
the strategy
corruption.
is
In
not
fact,
to allow
cumulatively,
me to
it's a
complete
lot
my
more.
train
No,
of
there's
thought.
no strategy. It's
All
a
right.
discussion.
Okay,
Great. So the point is the politics fuels the corruption because you pour money, you buy a vote, and the leader then gets in. Once the leader is in, they have to amass money to retain that position. So I agree it's a cultural problem, but it's very, very much fueled. Administrative measures that are not being enforced, such as these very basic election rules that a political party should adhere to. We are also seeing officers who contravene and who are on record not being, administrative action not being taken against them. So we incentivize corruption because if I happen to benefit from corruption, I can perpetuate myself. Okay. With regard to the amnesty, that discussion was on the table during the IPPG discussion. That discussion was on the table in 2003,
yes.
And it was then rejected. Not only that, right now we are working under the post-election violence agreement, and we have a TJRC, Truth, Justice and Reconciliation report, which was really about how to deal with the historical issues. We cannot throw back into the face of all Kenyans the TJRC report, the fact that we have had a fight against corruption and pretend perpetrating
still
it.
doing it. And Jerry,
I think, the sort of desired objective is to stop corruption, not to sort of catch these people and have them tried and what have you. And I find with civil societies, their aim becomes just to get whoever is involved into sort of courtrooms and so on. And they forget there's a critical social element to corruption. And that's what civil society should be dealing with. Get into petty corruption, understand why the public are involved, actually teach them their rights at the prescribed prices, actually show them the harm that the corruption they participate in does to society, and set up sort of whistleblowing mechanisms as opposed to going for government. That's the easy option. Whereas
Jerry,
petty corruption cumulatively actually has probably a bigger impact, not just economically, even on our social values.
Jerry, can the two not happen together? If you're talking about changing mindsets and changing behaviors
Absolutely.
and changing all of that, can the two
But if you're
not
looking
happen
for a radical impetus,
as
time to sort of go through processes, well, you've agreed it's a national disaster. If you're looking for a radical impetus, you need to do something drastic.
Okay, so we have a blanket amnesty. Then what? Then we start to change mindsets. At what point do you think we should then pick up the
what you've
process
now
of
done is
prosecuting
you've
those?
normalized not corrupt. That is now the new norm.
Shouldn't that already
And generally
be the case
speaking,
now,
the
though?
way people make their decisions and human behavior will dictate that you will follow the social norms. So that is the new norm, that there's no corrupt. And also there's the incentives. They're not monetary, but there's the public prestige. There's the idea of common purpose together. And this was evinced during Kibaki when he took over. Kenya was voted the most optimistic country because of the contextual cues
But
they were
optimism
changed.
aside, in Jerry, we still had cases of corruption even when Kibaki took over.
Yes, because
some would say it sounds a bit abstract to talk about being in a state of zero corruption and being optimistic
No, it's
about
new
it.
thinking, don't get me wrong, but to get things done differently, you need new thinking. So it does sound abstract.
And if Jerry was a little bit better informed, she would realize the work that civil society does on the ground with communities, trying to look for really a reconscientization. But it's very difficult to have a conversation with citizens. We're working in Nairobi, we're in one of the slum areas, and one of the issues is security. And we told the community, you have to be active, you've got rights. And they say, well, we have been catching, we know the young people who are raping our daughters, who are breaking into our households. We grab them, we take them to the chief. 2 days later, they've been released. Now, you're talking about very disempowered people, and their authority figure is in cahoots with the criminals. So this is what we are saying is a trickle-down sense of impunity, where if the state does not work, if the state does not follow the rules, then really the citizen is powerless to enforce it. And going back to that, very inspiring, and for me, I think my work is very at citizen action, I'm very inspired by the example that Jerry is saying, where ordinary citizens frog marched this police officer to the police station. Why did it stop? Because nothing happened, and because of the fear of recrimination.
On that, I'd like you to respond. There have been cases like that. Even when you're talking about the mechanism for whistleblowers, we haven't had a good record for whistleblowers. Many would remember Goldenberg and Munyake. So there have been those.
Now I'm talking about Wanjiku being able to make a phone call and say, I'm not able to get my bursary forms because I'm being asked to pay XYZ. So,
and you believe that doesn't happen currently?
I don't think...
To be fair, to an extent it does. The Huduma program, you know, to support your what you're saying, has begun to break down some of those impediments.
Let Jerry finish.
Okay. So I appreciate that with behavioral change and with what I'm talking about in terms of creating new contextual cues and a new environment where people are more deliberative about what they're doing in their actions, we do need laws, and I would suggest harsher ones, more draconian ones, if we were to create a blanket amnesty. There's also, without sort of sounding facetious, there's also the idea that there would be an influx of investment of money that was otherwise stored away in other countries. So it could be economically beneficial.
So it's blanket amnesty and asking those that have been implicated in corruption?
Asked, because there's a blanket amnesty, and you will see people bringing back investments that are put elsewhere.
I think beyond the utopic ideal, because I've been accused of really being very, very idealistic, but I think this is very utopic because government runs with systems, and part of our concern and why we were forced to do this press conference is looking at the fundamentals. For instance, one of the key institutions. This office was given additional powers. But you then see a law going through Parliament that is purposely being undermined.
All right.
So that the oversight institutions are actually being weakened. So it's good to look for the change in the citizens, but we cannot allow government to undermine.
Wanjiru, allow me then to ask this question, because Njeri makes a valid point. The systems we haven't been very effective in the fight against corruption. Take a look at what's happening with the Public Accounts Committee. There's infighting within the Ethics and Anti-Corruption Commission, and even as of that is now going to be discussed in Parliament, their possible removal. You take a look at what's happening within the courts. So what is this radical thing that's going to happen to make sure that we, to some point, rid ourselves of corruption? Jerry has a point. We've tried a lot of things. They don't seem to be working.
We have, well, like I was discussed, and that was benched, and we are working under a certain framework. You do not get into a governance discussion without the historical context, because then you actually undermine the legal basis and also the expectations, because we are working under a common agreement framework where we have a TJRC report that deals with historical,
but things need to be reflexive,
and that is the process which is being undermined by this government. So I am an optimist. I believe in Kenya. But looking at the fundamentals, I would say that if this government does not begin to uphold the Constitution, does not begin to implement the laws that were created at a very high cost and, after a lot of deliberation and consensus building, then we are headed for very dark days.
Okay. Jerry, what happens to all the money that has been lost through corruption?
Getting it back with the current methods anyway.
And you believe
so
we'll
we're
be able
losing
to get it
more
back?
by putting all our efforts and energy and all our resources into fighting these cases, while more corruption goes on, while these ideologies get further entrenched into our psyches as a society. And this is why I'm saying we need something radical, something that will make us rethink and reassess our attitudes towards public service, towards corruption as a whole. Corruption, some officers that would actually not want to get involved in corruption, there's social pressure from the communities around them.
But blanket amnesty would remove that pressure?
I think so. A blanket amnesty would force us to reassess our mental models on corruption.
And how are we doing this reassessment? Is it in any structured sort of way, or once we have blanket amnesty, are we sort of holding
our psychological reassessment?
Right, but help us explain how
in
that
terms
is
of how it will actually happen.
Context?
I'll get involved in the planning when it does. But there's no sort of structured way within which to do it. But the idea of starting again.
Right.
Because also the government has inherited a lot of cases and we keep going back to them. And all that's happening with the blame game, you know, there's no discourse about the solutions. There's no discussions about the solutions. In fact, blaming is simply a mechanism to vent your sort of anger and dissatisfaction at something. But there is no solution. We've sat here and we've listened to many cases. There's a lot of facts Wanjiku has, which is...
Wanjiru, please.
Sorry about
that. That's okay.
Happens a lot. There's a lot of facts Wanjiru has, and it's interesting, but we've been hearing this all week. What is the solution?
All right. Do we have an example of where this has worked before to perhaps give Kenyans an idea that blanket amnesty has been used in a different society, in a different community, in a different country? Is this best practice across the world?
No, it's not best practice, but neither, you know, there was no example of M-Pesa. We can understand our unique situation, we can understand our culture, and actually apply our own homemade solutions, homegrown solutions.
Okay. I'm very disturbed by this discussion because on one hand, the thinking is good, but then when you fail to look at the context in which the discussion is taking place and begin to propose a blanket amnesty, are you saying that people elected under the Constitution of Kenya, state officers, who have deliberately subverted their office and subverted the law to enrich themselves, deserve an amnesty? I think that's a gross injustice.
What are you suggesting?
Well, my proposal is the Constitution should be upheld, the law should be enforced, and, you know, when the President, you know, really, the Commander-in-Chief, when he gets this title, he cannot then step away from the actions of his state officers unless he then shows an action against them when they breach the law. What we see is that he talks about talking tough on corruption, but he doesn't do anything. So if his state officers are the ones perpetrating corruption, let him dismiss them. Let him get them to step aside and allow investigations to happen. Let the investigations be made public. And let's not forget, we have laws. We are governed by a supreme constitution, which has laws under it. And the problem that we are now having is a failure to enforce those laws.
All right, and you then want him to address that issue of enforcing the laws.
We want him to do that, and we also said that we will have a citizen outreach campaign, simply because we feel Kenyans have been betrayed very many times. Kenyans work hard, Kenyans have, you know, held on to the promise, Kenyans, you know, they keep showing up. NARC, they showed up. Constitution, they showed up. With this government, the digital government, with all its good ideas, but in implementation, it's gotten carried away, and I think it's bound by succession politics and how to keep itself in power.
Okay, Jerry, our final thoughts as we go into this, your solution, we can grasp around blanket amnesty, but tell us what happens after that. Just leave us with that thought. So you start with blanket amnesty, then what?
And there would be sort of draconian laws where there would be very serious consequences, even for the pettiest of corruption by individuals, members of the public, not just public officers, and get together programs that will further reinforce that. But I think with a blanket amnesty, we can start over again. That's what I'm suggesting. And nothing is static. So we say, you know, there was reports and there's laws. Nothing is static. We can be reflexive. We had Germany's debt wiped out because they saw it caused a war, whereas that was in keeping with international law. So because the current mechanisms are not working, let's start thinking differently. Let's start understanding corruption from an individual perspective, psychologically, through to the collective psychology that we have around corruption, because that's what drives it, that's what keeps it persistent. All this legislation, oversight committees, they work, but they will not succeed if we don't have that social element. And I think that's what civil society should be focusing on, not blaming.
Okay, all right. Wanjiru, what happens after the 7 days elapses and the president hasn't addressed the nation in the way in which you want him to? We can see some of the demands that you have made, and those are on our Super Bowl tonight. But what happens after 7 days?
Well, one is we are monitoring the situation. Two, we defend and uphold the Constitution, and we expect the president to do the same. And, you know, contrary to what Jerry is saying, we are not starting again. We started again in 2010 after the bloodletting in 2000. To agree to platitudes and palliatives. We want to see action, and we will monitor the situation. And Yvonne, believe me, you'll be the first to know and to see our action.
Mass action?
Well, we didn't say mass action, we said citizen. Sovereignty, Article number 1, is vested in the people of Kenya, and we will go back to the people because at the end of the day, they are the ones who vote in our political leaders. It is our responsibility to hold them accountable. It's also our responsibility to shun corruption. So there is that duality. But what we're saying is we have been let down by our political leadership, and 2 years into the Jubilee administration, they have gone badly off course, and we feel it's our responsibility to speak out so that we can embolden those public officers who do the right thing, because we do believe there are a lot of public officers who are in adherence to the law, but there's a good, you know, possibly some cartels that action in defense of our Constitution.
All right, thank you both for coming. Jerry Thorne and Wanjiru Gikonyo, Institute for Social Accountability. Jerry Thorne is a political communications consultant. Thank you very